CGTN, China Global Television Network.
African countries contribute little to the world's greenhouse gas emissions, but they still bear the brunt of global warming. And now US President Donald Trump's decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord, an agreement signed by all 54 African countries, is likely to make this worse. Donald Trump has promised to stop all payments of US tax dollars to UN global warming programs. But with the US stepping away from its role as one of the global leaders of the fight against climate change, African countries will need to move closer towards a clean energy industry. So, what else can African countries do to mitigate the potential negative effects expected from Trump's decision? And what role can China play in helping the continent cut its share of emissions? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, 7 out of the world's 10 countries considered the most threatened by climate change are in Africa. So a US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement is bound to hit the continent the hardest. It is the region least responsible, most vulnerable, and least able to afford the cost of adapting to global climate change. Harry Horton takes a closer look at the potential impact of the withdrawal on the continent.
In a continent that's barely contributed to greenhouse gas emissions, scientists predict Africa will feel the full impact of climate change. That impact is already being felt through drought, food shortages, floods and storms. Researchers say this could lead to more poverty, more conflict and weaker economies. And Donald Trump's decision to pull the US out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement threatens to make those problems worse.
As of today, the United States will cease all implementation of the non-binding Paris Accord. This includes ending the implementation of the nationally determined contribution and, very importantly, the Green Climate Fund, which is costing the United States a vast fortune.
The Green Climate Fund promised $100 billion a year to help developing countries mitigate climate change. 20% of the fund would go to projects in Africa. Environmental activists say the loss of US money is a blow for African nations.
The primary problem is going to be food insecurity. And there are solutions to those problems, right? We know how to address drought and famine in a lot of ways. They just need resources. And unfortunately, the United States and the Trump administration has basically said that we're going to leave communities to fend for themselves and we're not going to provide the resources they need.
President Trump, you're so vile!
Supporters of the Paris Agreement say they hope other countries will remain committed to combating climate change.
There is a momentum in one direction. The United States government has decided to take to step away from a table that is going to keep working on solutions for climate change.
We don't yet know what the full impact of Donald Trump's decision to take the US out of the Paris deal will be. The fear for African countries is that they'll feel that impact sooner, and for them, it could be much worse. Harry Horton, CGTN, Washington.
Meanwhile, the African Union said it was both shocked and saddened by Trump's decision to withdraw the US from the Paris Climate Change Agreement. African Union officials told CGTN that it was one of the saddest days for the continent as it struggles with climate change-related disasters. CGTN's Gerum Chala has more.
Anger, disappointment and frustration can simply summarize the reaction people here at the AU have after Donald Trump withdrew the US from the Paris Climate Change Agreement. African Union officials said the United States has broken its promises for Africa and the rest of the world, and its authorities displayed dangerous carelessness towards mankind's future existence. Climate change experts here also said Trump's decision affects Africa more than any other continent. The continent has so far been suffering from climate change-related disasters, while it has got little to do with the emission of fatal gas to the environment. And so, when big emitters like the US withdraw from a binding agreement, it's a lot of disappointment for Africa and its people. There's more. Out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, Africa expected to significantly benefit through what is known as carbon trading. Africa had plans of getting paid from the most developed states in return to its forests, which are a lifeline for the world's healthier environment, despite huge emissions from the industries across the world. People here say that dream is now dashed because of President Trump's decision of taking the United States out of its global commitment and responsibilities. Group Data CGTN at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa.
And now to offer further analysis into the possible impact of the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement on Africa, I have expert guests standing by. In Washington, D.C., Ephraim Nkonya, he's a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute. In Beijing, Wu Changhua, she's the chair of the China Redesign Hub. And with me here in Nairobi, Dr. Richard Munang, he's the regional Climate Change Coordinator at the United Nations Environment Program. Thank you all for joining us on the program. Dr. Munang, I'll start off with you, though, because President Donald Trump announced that the United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. First, your reaction to that news.
Thank you very much, British. Very important question. The science of climate change is unequivocally clear, and the world needs more action and not less. And climate change is a global responsibility, and every nation have that responsibility to be able to act and to act so right now. So the pullout of the United States from the Paris Agreement, though disappointing, is happening at a time when the world is actually ratcheting up their actions, including Africa showing leadership. So overarchingly, despite the fact that the United States have pulled out, what the science is showing and also what countries are doing means that the world is actually taking climate change action as an opportunity and actually leveraging on actions that can be able to drive socio-economic opportunities for millions.
Right. Wu Changhua, in Beijing, your reaction to that news?
I think Paris Agreement proves to be a collective decision of the global community to tackle climate change issues, which requires collective actions. And it also symbolizes a major progress step forward of the global environmental governance. President Trump's decision to withdraw U.S. out of the Paris Agreement, literally disrupting this international effort, the collective actions and decisions. And to a large extent, it's creating huge unfairness to countries in Africa, in other more vulnerable regions and countries, because Africa, if you look at Africa today, most of the countries or many of the countries in Africa are literally suffering from climate change negative impact already. This is not fair to African countries, not fair to other developing countries.
Right. Ephraim Nkonya in the U.S.
This is a decision which actually is very wrong, and it's going to be affecting the current generation and the future generation, which is the most is going to be most affected. Look, the U.S. has been a leader in the world for many things, and when the Paris Agreement came in, there was a lot of work which was done, and the Chinese person said, this is a collective thing because climate change does not know borders. There is an effect, and the effect is spread worldwide. And such the investment into climate change to mitigate climate change should be a collective action. And U.S. stepping out of this is something which is very unfortunate, and is actually going to be hurting the U.S. people and the rest of the world, especially Africa, which are most affected by climate change.
Dr. Munang, though, the U.S. has been a leader, as Ephraim there says, has been a leader in the world in many issues here. So how much of a setback is this in international negotiations, international efforts to try and combat climate change?
The changing climate, as I started off by saying, is already here with us today. And Africa have actually shown leadership, as well as other countries like China and India and the European Union. But as we're speaking today, the Paris Agreement have been ratified by African countries, more than all the countries in other part of the region. And currently, as we're speaking today, 37 African countries have ratified the Paris Agreement, bringing that to 68% of the continent. And it means that African countries are taking leadership because they've actually seen the opportunities that are inherent in this Paris Agreement today. And as a result of this, the leadership that is shown by Africa is an opportunity for Africa to take the center stage, especially also given the fact that the continent is blessed with abundant natural resources, especially in renewable energy, sunshine, wind, and hydropower.
Right. Wu Changwa, I just want to come back briefly to what this means for the global international efforts, though, because the Paris Agreement was seen as a triumph of global cooperation. So how big a blow is this to international efforts to tackle climate change?
It is a major blow, as reflected already from all the responses from the world since last week, because we're talking about a global challenge. We're talking about a global environmental governance. Just imagine a global governance without the world's largest economy, US, around the table. Is it still global? It's no longer global. So on one side, I think the US president's decision or announcement withdrawing from the Paris Agreement challenges hugely how we govern our global environmental and climate change issues. On the other, I think it challenges the wisdom for countries collectively. How do we really make more efforts, put pressures, and also persuading the US to come back to the table? Because without the US around the table, there's no way we're going to address the global challenges like climate change.
Ephraim Nkwanga, is that a blow? Is that damage to international efforts being felt in the United States?
Yeah, look, US, for example, between 2010 and 2016, it contributed $2.5 billion to help developing countries, poor countries, to adapt to climate change and to do the mitigation. And look, if you're investing money, you are going to look a place where you can have the highest returns. And if you invest in carbon mitigation, the investment in Africa always has the highest return. There was a very good study which was done by us, and it shows that, well, if you invest to just mitigate 1 ton of carbon, you're going to have the highest return in Africa than anywhere on earth. So under the Obama administration between 2010 and 2016, they invested about $2.5 billion. And in 2016, Obama, when he was visiting China, he also promised that he's going to invest $3 billion. So that money was going to the right place, and it was going to have the highest returns. And as such, we have to be optimistic that some people are going to have some wisdom out of this, because right. Look, yes, the government of US is a government, but there are companies which are still investing, and we are still seeing they are having some commitment to continue investing in climate change mitigation.
Right, Dr. Munang, of course, you did mention earlier that Africa is already showing leadership in climate change initiatives here, though. But does this change, though, does it bring about uncertainties in other countries as well? Because the US now becomes one of 3, with Syria and Nicaragua, I believe, who were not part of that accord. Does this introduce other uncertainties, or are climate change efforts still on track?
Climate change efforts, even with the entire world, 195 countries that adopted this Paris Agreement in December 2015, when the UN Environment released a report, which was called Emissions Gap Report, it shows that if every action that countries who actually sign up to this agreement were put together, the world will still be headed towards a 3.2 to a 3.4 degree, which is above the 2 degrees dangerous temperature that the world is not supposed to reach, to ensure that we're not facing the drought and floods and people submerged and the suffering, especially in the African continent. Meaning, with the US still part of the Paris Agreement, the world still needed to ratchet up the ambition, the actions. However, with the US announcing the pull out, China have stepped forward, India have stepped forward, the European Union have stepped forward, and all these are showing that it is because of the opportunities that are inherent within this Paris Agreement. And when you dovetail this within the African context, which is actually one of the most vulnerable continents in the world,
Right.
The changing climate is providing an opportunity. And if you look at what Africa has always presented, especially during the negotiation of the Paris Agreement in the name of national determined contributions, they actually identify areas within this agriculture and energy. And this is providing an opportunity for the continent to look at how they can be able to ratchet these actions, to implement actions that can be able to unleash and address the socio-economic aspects of poverty, of food insecurity, and actually contribute to macroeconomic growth. So Africa is going to benefit as a result of putting these actions in place.
Right, Dr. Munang, we'll leave it there for the moment, but we'll take a short break for now. And when we come back, we'll have more insights into Africa and the Paris Agreement. To stay with us.
Africa is not one story.
There is a saying in China, our words count and our actions should be successful. China will stand by its responsibility on climate change, and China doesn't stand alone on this issue. Our scientists in this area are in connection with the world and follow climate protection developments very closely.
That was Chinese Premier Li Keqiang speaking in Berlin last week, where he reiterated China's stance of implementing its commitment to the Paris Agreement. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, during a press conference last week, the Chinese Foreign Ministry also weighed in on the American withdrawal. Spokesperson Hua Chunying said that China's stance on climate change is consistent and clear, and that all parties should cherish the hard-won result of the Paris Agreement. Let's take a listen.
The Chinese government is paying close attention to the issue of climate change, resolutely following the innovative, coordinated, green, open and shared ideas of development, and implementing policy actions and responding to climate change positively. We have made obvious achievements, which is not only our international responsibility as a large developing country, but an inherent need of China's sustainable development.
And we continue our discussion now, and I still have my expert guest standing by in Washington, D.C., Ephraim Nkonya, Senior Research Fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute in Beijing, Wu Changhua. She's the chair of the China Redesign Hub, and with me in studio here, Dr. Richard Munang, Regional Climate Change Coordinator and UNEP, still with us on the program. Wu Changhua, let me go off to you first, because Richard Munang did mention that China had now stepped forward, or I believe Ephraim Konya did mention that China has now stepped forward with that U.S. exit. Of course, the world is going to be looking at China, will be looking at India following a possible U.S. exit here. So what contribution is China going to be making? What is China's position here?
I think from China perspective, let me take you probably one step back. Ever since last week, I think the world's attention, most of the attention has been focusing on China, how China was going to respond to U.S. President's decision or announcement, and also whether China would be willing to step up its leadership to fill the void created by U.S. announcement at this moment. So most of the attention was on China. So if you look at China specifically, China started already a couple of years ago on a few fronts in terms of working more closely with the other developing countries. If you look at China and Africa, there were three things at least that has been sort of enhancing China and Africa relations and partnerships. One is a South-South collaboration. China committed to a South-South Climate Fund, putting in the basket somewhere $200 billion and from the public funding to support other developing countries to tackle climate change issues, particularly focus on increasing capacity and creating new energy development opportunities and build up clean energy or clean infrastructure. Second front actually is the China-Africa strategic partnership. And there's also a funding mechanism created with more than $600 billion committed from China to support African countries specifically to develop clean energy, clean industry, and also build up a clean infrastructure there. And the third angle is the One Belt, One Road initiative. Now there are about 85 countries already in this partnership, and many of them from Africa.
Right.
So China, to a large extent, has already started a very, very close partnership, focusing on actions and practice solutions, working with other developing countries to tackle this issue. So whether China will step up to fill the so-called void or not, I think China will carry on its own commitment on domestic front, but more importantly, stepping up efforts, putting resources together to support other developing countries to move forward together.
Dr. Munang, climate financing has been a key issue here, and of course that $100 billion kitty that was meant to help developing countries mitigate and adapt to climate change effect here. So what now? What happens now?
Actually, the Green Climate Fund, as it currently is today, is just above 11 billion. But it needed to be capitalized up to 100 billion. So we're still short of that. But what the science is telling us, especially what is going to happen in the African continent if we hit the 2 degree, and I was speaking today, we are 1.1 degrees. So we're just a couple of degrees, degrees away from the 2 degrees. And as a result of that, if we were to hit 2 degrees, Africa will need 50 billion, which means even with the GCF as it currently is today, the amount in there will not be enough. So what does this mean? It means that Africa also needs to look internally. And looking internally means that they need to look at alternatives and look at sectors whereby if they were to invest, we could be able to build climate resilience and ensure that the youth who are unemployed, currently 60% of the 200 million youth that the continent have today unemployed, and we're seeing so many of them migrating out of the continent, shows that climate change is a security issue.
Right.
And if it's a security issue, just as prominence and importance is given to national security, it should be given to climate action, because climate action will also address food insecurity that is affecting 240 million people today. So the overarching way forward is looking internally as enshrined in Article 9, Paragraph 2 of the Paris Agreement is an essential way to be able to implement actions, but implement those actions in catalytic areas like agriculture and renewable energy to add value. And the most important thing is, as we're speaking, Africa is 20 times less productive than most developed countries. And it is because it is not adding value to what it produces. It's exporting raw materials and spending 35 billion in importing food. So if Africa can be able to produce and process utilizing clean energy, it can be able to create the jobs and actually reduce the unemployment and also build resilience of communities in the continent.
Right. Ephraim Konya, let's get your perspective on that.
First of all, let me talk about China, the role of China that it plays in Africa. China is now the second largest donor to Africa after the US. But if you look at the structure of the support that it's giving, it is still very much into the energy and the transportation and other things. Issues related to environment, China has not done much. But now, given that now US is stepping out, we hope that China is going to be increasing the investment and the support in the area of environment, which includes the climate change. But if you also look at what China has done internally in its own country, you can see that there is a very stellar example of payment for ecosystem services. There have been a lot of green great wall in the Gobi Desert and other places, which is showing the way what we can do in countries in Africa and in the African countries. Yes, we have to invest a lot in carbon sequestration and carbon mitigation because it is affecting us. But at the same time, once we invest into that, there are two types of benefits. There is the benefit which is internal, we get it ourselves, and benefits to the world. And in this regard, we see that maybe in our study that we just concluded, we show that the benefit is off farm, the benefit goes away from you, is about 54%, and only 46% is internal. So there is need for African countries to invest into the carbon sequestration because they have direct benefits into it.
Right, Wu Changhua, though China is one of the world's top producers of renewable energy here, and it has been pointed out that it probably needs to increase its investment externally, particularly in Africa, though. Are we going to see a bigger push, though, from on that front in terms of renewable energy?
I think so. I think the push or the efforts, the track record is already on the ground, and definitely we can do more. The foundation is already laid. I want to emphasize one particular point for Africa. I think Africa today is at a critical juncture. On one side, I think, yes, we have to bear the climate resilience, the climate challenges, the consequences. But in the meantime, it's a critical moment of choice. I think particularly look at experiences, efforts from China, African countries can learn a lot from that process. And with the technology progress already on the table around the renewable energy, around the environmental protection, ecological recovery, everything together, I think African countries faces a huge opportunities in terms of choosing green and smart and clean development paradigm. Only by doing so, we'll be able to take advantage of the technology progress, taking advantage of the investment available on the table, and potentially, all around the world that's market driven, so that we'll be able to create jobs, creating clean industry, clean energy, clean infrastructure in Africa. But in the meantime, that's going to dramatically contributing to the solution of global climate challenges that would definitely benefit African countries as well.
Dr. Munang, though Africa is at a critical point, there is a lot it can learn from China. What else can Africa do, though, in the moment to mitigate and adapt?
A lot can be done. There are no absence of innovation across the African continent. And if you look across the continent, from west to east, north to south, central, innovations are existing, but those innovations have not been brought to the fore. If you just look right here in Kenya, the mobile money M-Pesa, which has been combined to decentralize clean energy off-grid in what is called M-Kupa, have actually not only reached 400,000 people, but it's actually transforming their lives and helping people in Eastern Africa, kids, to be able to study. And if you look in the western part of Africa, there is a technology called Zai, which is being used and have actually proven to increase yields up to about 500 kilograms per hectare, even in years that doesn't have rain. What is happening is that these technologies and innovative aspects need to be brought to the fore. And to do so, there needs to be investment, especially in solar energy, utilizing the knowledge that is existing, because we have common problems and also common solutions. And therefore, inclusive partnerships become very, very important, because in Section 5 of the Paris Agreement, state and non-state actors are very crucial in implementation, and therefore private sector, NGOs, civil societies, individual citizens like you and me must be able to come on board and drive climate actions as an investment opportunity, because that is the only way that we can be able to build climate resilience and actually ensure that the continent doesn't experience the fear of want on it.
Right, and we'll leave it there for the moment. That's all we have time for this week, but thank you to my guests for their insights in Washington, D.C. Ephraim Nkonya, he's a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute in Beijing. Wu Changhua, she's the chair of the China Redesign Hub. And with me here in Nairobi, Dr. Richard Munang, he is the Regional Climate Change Coordinator at the United Nations Environment Program. Thank you for joining us here on the program. And do remember to join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. Goodbye.